Live again from Immerse 2017, and I'm here with Charles Henden. Charles was on one of the panels earlier today. You can see that on Beach City Life. We had a little bit of internet trouble here today,
Right,
so some of the panel sessions we had to record, and we'll upload them later tonight. But they'll be there.
Good.
We've checked. We've got the footage.
got the
It just
footage,
didn't go
that's it.
live. So Charles, can you tell us a little bit about what you've got set up here and what you were talking about particularly today on the panel?
Sure. Yeah, the panel was about interactive VR filmmaking, and that's what we've got today. Behind us, we've got the story of a young US war veteran, and the technology that we have enables us to kind of bring the viewer into the stories and into the memories of traumatic experiences that people have had, or joyous experiences, and basically to do very immersive storytelling.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, when you talk about sort of the traumatic experiences,
Yeah.
what are some examples of the type of traumatic experiences that?
Well, the story that we're telling in this piece involves someone who was pulled into the war around the time of 9/11. So it's someone who wasn't ready to go to Iraq and see various pieces of wartime. So there's a lot of trauma that happens around war and service. So there's a lot of stories that people tell, and I think that's the part of PTSD, is that those memories are stored inside a lot of people, and they have to carry them around inside them. So we're trying to convey some of those emotions and concepts, and the technology helps us get closer to reality in that regard.
So when I was talking to some people, telling them we were coming up to do this event, and some pretty tech savvy people, and we're saying VR art and VR filmmaking, still very mystified.
Yeah.
So what you're doing here and how you approach this, how would you help demystify that for people that have just got no idea how to even start to conceptualize it?
Well, for starters, I would say that there's no fault for anyone being mystified by it. I'm in the industry and I find it completely magical. The technology has moved really fast. I think the way to think about it is the technology now allows us to be inside the computer CG environment. So previously, if you see someone working on a CG film, they're sitting down at a computer and they have to use the mouse and keyboard and a flat screen to look at the world that's actually inside the computer.
Yep.
And what VR allows us to do is go inside and feel like we're inside those worlds, and to bring people inside. So that's one way I'd say. It's almost like looking into the mirror and being able to step into the mirror, and that's what VR's brought to us.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, what's your background? Is your background coming from sort of a media filmmaking and then moved into VR, or how have you come at this technology?
There's a lot of different ways in, from animation to fine art, as we've heard today. My background is in video games. So I was recently making cricket and rugby Australian sports games for the PlayStation and Xbox, that kind of thing. All the while the VR industry's kind of been bubbling along, and made the jump to work in that industry primarily. So yeah, there's lots of ways to come at it, and games is kind of my experience and standpoint. And I think from now on, I think this is the start of the VR industry. There's going to be VR schools and places where you can sort of dive directly in. But I think, even if you're a songwriter or a conventional artist, it can all be applied to produce an experience in VR, because that's what it's all about, having a real experience.
So I know the VR came from sort of the gaming industry, and one of the discussions today was around the commercialisation and seeing enterprise adopting these sorts of technologies, and I was interested to hear some of the education applications that are emerging. And then there was also some talk about the enterprise and VR for enterprise. How do you see that evolving over the next few years?
Well, as with any new technology, there's some really clear parallels. I think one of the first ones of those is simulation and training. Simulation is used everywhere from healthcare to mining, and I think anyone who's ever had to do any kind of, if you've ever had to do your basic life support, we simulate a situation with a dummy where you have to resuscitate a dummy.
Yep.
So that's a really clear kind of situation which we could do in VR. Learning how to use a machine, familiarization with a site or an induction, that kind of stuff, that can be done in VR. utility you get to be able to familiarize yourself with a place without having to go there is pretty powerful.
Right.
So there's some examples of some really clear go-tos for the technology.
Yeah.
For enterprise, I think we're still exploring the kind of possibilities that are out there. Everything from I think if you're in a design art type job, creating experiences and creating places for people to be in. That's something that you can do in VR. There's a lot of people here today that do all of their creation primarily in virtual reality.
Actually, the art, particularly the art creation,
side, yeah.
in virtual reality. So, and also there was talk about training train drivers and heavy equipment drivers. And
Yeah.
So, for somebody that has never put on a VR mask and doesn't actually understand, is it to replace the training of actually hands-on in those machines and the heavy equipment, or is it to supplement it and augment that training?
I think there's examples of both. I think right now it's really up to the implementers to make sure that they use VR where it makes sense. So, something like basic life support, where you're doing chest compressions, that's something where you don't want to make any, you want to do that in the most real setting as you can.
Right,
you wouldn't try and replace existing proven methods. And I think there's a great example online actually of a heavy loader simulation. And what they've done is used VR for the visuals, but for the actual controls of the loader, they use real controls. So you're in VR, you've got one of these headsets on, but your hands are on real crane controls.
Right.
And they got someone who is a complete novice they called it training to craning. And he spent, I think, 8 hours in a simulator, and then they put him in this multi-million-dollar crane and got him to move things around. And I think everyone was crossing their fingers and biting their teeth and being very nervous. But he was someone who was a complete novice who went from nothing to successfully doing tasks on this huge loader in a very short period of time. So I think the answer is eventually we will be replacing, but for now we need to pick the right applications for the technology and use the strengths where we can.
Right. And so if people want to know more about your work, Charles, and what you're doing, how can they find you and how can they follow you on social media?
Yeah, so I started a studio this year called Visitor, and our website is visitor.vision, and we're a Brisbane-based VR studio. So on Twitter it's @visitorvision, and the website's visitor.vision.
Okay, so we'll put a link in the post on our Facebook page.
Sure.
And are you on Instagram as well?
On Instagram it's all the same, visitorvision.
Visitor.vision.
Visitor.vision, yeah. So there's a card.
Excellent. I got networking.
Yeah. This is where it all happens, at the coast.
It does. So thanks very much, Charles. It was
problem.
it was great to hear you talking earlier on, and amazing stuff I think that you're doing here.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. All the best.